The north is cold and full of whispers.
The candle had burned to its last inch. Sam hadn't noticed. He noticed it now because the flame guttered sideways, caught the pooled tallow wrong, and threw the left half of his reading table into darkness. He shifted the candlestick closer to the open manuscript, close enough to feel the heat against his cheek, and leaned in until the words stopped blurring. The library tower of Winterfell smelled like cold stone and old leather, and the particular dampness of a room that had never once in its existence been warm. There was a brazier behind him. It had been lit when he started, and it was close to dead now, and he hadn't fed it because feeding it meant standing up, and standing up meant breaking the thread of cross-referencing he'd held for the last 4 hours, and the thread was the only thing keeping him from losing the page. Maester Wolkin's inventory records were stacked to his left. The primary manuscripts, older, more fragile, some of them rolled and cracked from decades of improper storage, were spread to his right, in the order he'd pulled them. Most were administrative. Most were the kind of document that only a maester or a very specific kind of fool read by choice. Grain tallies, weather records, correspondence about disputed borders settled generations ago. He had gone through 41 of them since the second bell. The 42nd was different. He found it on the 11th page. The handwriting changed, tightened, compressed, the letters pushed close together in the way of a man writing fast because the thing he needs to record is still vivid and he is afraid the vividness will leave him. This was not a formal record. The Dornish maester who wrote it had never given his name in any of the pages, and Sam had the feeling, reading, that the omission was deliberate. What the man had written was not sanctioned. It was a field account, notes written in the hours after the dust settled at Hellholt, before anyone had decided what the official account of events would say. Sam's hands went still on the table. He read the line 4 times. The beast is armored in fire and scale, but the eye is naked as a man's. The rest of the account was technical. That was the thing that lodged in his chest like a coal. Not the poetry of the line, but the precision of everything that followed it. Throwing arm specifications, bolt geometry with exact measurements in the old Dornish standard, tactical notes on the angle of a dragon's head when it banks into a strafing run, the window of exposure during the bank, the correct aim point and the correction for wind. The writer had been on the tower at Hellholt when the bolt was loosed. He had been watching, and he had written down exactly what he saw, and what he saw was not a miracle. It was physics. It was engineering. It was the careful, patient, unglamorous work of men who understood probability and had built enough machines and fired enough bolts that one of them, eventually, found the place where the armor stopped. Sam sat back. His shadow on the shelves behind him was long and wrong. He needed Bran before he needed Jon. The calculation arrived without him deciding to make it. Jon would act. Jon would always act. What Sam needed, before he put this in front of a man whose first instinct was forward motion, was confirmation, not the academic confirmation of a maester's assessment, the other kind. He rolled the manuscript carefully, tucked it inside his coat against the cold, and went to find the three-eyed raven. Bran was in the Godswood. He was always in the Godswood now. The cold between the library tower and the heart tree was a different kind of cold. Not the stale, trapped cold of a room, but the open, directional cold of a Winterfell night that had been below freezing for 11 days, without interruption. Sam's breath came in hard white clouds. The flagstones under his boots were dry, but the frost on the edges of them caught the moonlight. The yard was empty. 3 in the morning, and even the guards on the upper wall were invisible from here, reduced to the small sound of boots on stone somewhere above. He found the chair first. Then he found Bran. The eyes were white. Sam stood at a careful distance and waited. He knew not to touch him during. He knew not to call out sharply. He had made that mistake once in the first week after Bran's return, and the sound Bran had made coming back suddenly was not something Sam wanted to hear again. So he stood in the Godswood with his hands inside his sleeves, and a manuscript against his ribs, and he listened to Winterfell breathing at 3 in the morning. The heart tree loomed. The carved face was half in shadow, one eye dark, one eye catching the moonlight, and the red sap in its cuts had frozen at the edges in tiny dark crystals. The weirwood root beside the chair was the width of Sam's torso, pale and dense as old bone, running down into the earth at an angle that suggested it ran a very long way before it stopped. Sam looked at the root for a long time. He wasn't sure how long Bran had been out here. His hands on the chair arms looked like they'd been still for hours. There was frost on the back of his left hand. "Bran," Sam said quietly. He pulled the manuscript from his coat. He found the 11th page. He held it up even though Bran's eyes were white and Bran couldn't see him. He wasn't sure why he did it. It felt like it mattered. Bran read one line, maybe less, and went somewhere else. Sam counted. It was the only thing to do with the part of his mind that wanted to move, to shake him, to say, come back, I need you to come back. He counted instead. He reached 47 before Bran's eyes changed. Not quickly, not with any drama. The white receded, the way it always did, slowly, steadily, like light finding a room after a long dark. Bran looked at Sam. His breathing was even, his face gave nothing. He said, "It's real." 2 words. The same flat, exhausted voice he used for everything now. The voice that had shed all the registers of emphasis because when you had seen everything, none of it was more surprising than any other thing. Sam had stopped expecting Bran to sound like Bran, but sometimes still the flatness of it knocked the air out of him. He rolled the manuscript back. His hands were steadier than he expected. Jon read it in the great hall. Sam had considered waking him. He had decided against it. He had sat in the corridor outside the great hall for 40 minutes watching the fire through the gap in the door, deciding, and what he decided was that a man who read this particular document in the dark of his own chamber at 4 a.m. was a man who might make the wrong first decision. The great hall was better, more space between the words and whatever Jon would do with them. Jon came down an hour before dawn, the way he always did, already dressed, the gray wool of his coat carrying the cold from the room upstairs. He stopped when he saw Sam. He looked at the manuscript on the table, and he looked at Sam's face, and he sat down. He read it once. He turned back to the 11th page and read it again. He set it flat on the table, and he looked at the fire. He did not speak. The fire was the only sound in the great hall. The cold came up through the stone floor, through boot leather, through everything. Sam had stopped feeling his feet an hour ago. He watched Jon's jaw, the muscle working once, then going still, the way it did when Jon was inside a calculation he didn't like the shape of. Sam let the silence run until he couldn't. The dragons are not gods, Jon. Jon's eyes came off the fire. They are meat, Sam said. They have always been meat. The Dornish proved it 300 years ago, we just forgot. The words sat between them on the table next to the manuscript in the firelight. Jon picked the manuscript back up. His thumb found the line, the eye as naked as a man's, and pressed the buckled parchment flat, and held it flat, and read the line again in the way of a man who is reading something he already knows but needs the confirmation of the letters in front of him. He was not relieved. Sam had expected something like relief, or the Jon version of it, which was usually just a forward lean and a question about logistics. What he saw instead was the weight of a man revising a calculation he had already made peace with. Jon had been preparing to sail south. He had been building, in the long nights over the maps, a version of this negotiation in which the North had nothing and needed everything, and the cost of that arrangement was a crown he didn't want and fealty that the North would chafe under for a generation. He had been making his peace with that cost. This document didn't remove the cost. It changed what he was paying for. And it meant that Daenerys Targaryen, who had 3 dragons and the armies the North needed to survive the long night, was no longer only a reluctant potential ally. She was also, now, something else. Jon set the manuscript down. He looked at the fire for another moment, at the thing that was forming in the space behind his eyes. Then he stood and walked to the door of the great hall and called out into the corridor. "Send for Lady Sansa." His voice carried. The cold swallowed the echo. He stood in the doorway and did not come back to the table. Sansa read it alone. Jon had left the manuscript on the table when he went for his walk. The habitual pre-dawn circuit of the walls that was his version of thinking without an audience. She didn't wait for him to return. She pulled the manuscript across the table and read it. Once. That was enough. The part Jon would dwell on. The moral weight, the question of what this meant for Daenerys, the cost in trust and alliance, and the complicated arithmetic of asking someone for armies while also telling them their dragons could be killed. All of it was real and all of it would need reckoning. But Sansa had spent the last year learning that the reckoning could wait. The reckoning always needed something built first. Wood, iron, time, men who knew what they were doing. She pulled a sheet of blank parchment from the stack at the end of the table and started writing before the candle burned another quarter-inch, which northern castles had capable smiths. Not adequate, capable. Men who had worked iron in volume and under pressure and had not broken the first time a lord breathed down their neck. She wrote 13 names, crossed out 2 where she wasn't certain of the forge condition after last winter's damage. 11. Timber supply by region. The weirwood question required Bran. She understood enough of the old religion to know that cutting a living tree from the network would cost her more in northern loyalty than the wood was worth. So she set it aside and worked iron and hardwood first. The ironwood stands east of the last river, the hardwood stores at Cerwyn, partially stockpiled before Lord Cerwyn died at the Blackwater, road access from outlying castles to Winterfell for final assembly. She was still writing when the first gray light came through the high windows. She sent for Bran before Jon returned. 4 lines about the fallen weirwood, trees already dead, lying in the deep wolfswood where no one had cause to go. She didn't waste his time with preamble. Bran wrote back in 6 lines before the second bell. There were fallen trees. He knew where. He could direct the crews. She added it to the timber column and kept writing. The lords came at mid-morning. Sansa had not called a council. She had called a meeting. A council was where northern lords gathered to establish relative position through volume and accumulated grievance. A meeting was where someone told them what they were going to do. She stood at the head of the table. Jon stood to her left. The manuscript sat at the center, held flat by 2 small iron weights. Beside it was Maester Wolkin's sketch, the proportions slightly wrong, the bracket mechanism approximated rather than precise, but clear enough for men who built things for a living. The shape of it was unmistakable. Robert Glover sat directly across from the sketch, 52 years old, with the face of a man who had done a great deal of arithmetic in his life, and had a good sense of when numbers added up and when they didn't. He looked at the drawing for a long time. He did not speak. Lyanna Mormont was at the far end of the table. 12 years old, sitting in her chair like it was a campaign seat she had selected specifically for the field of view it gave her. She had not looked at the sketch. She had been watching Sansa since she walked in. Sansa spoke for 11 minutes. She did not perform urgency. She stated the situation, what the manuscript was, what the Dornish had done at Hellholt, what the North's current position against dragons looked like, and what it would look like in 35 days if every house in the room gave her what she was about to ask for. She showed them the sketch. She laid out the construction specifications. She gave them numbers, units per castle, timeline per unit, material requirements, road schedule for moving components to Winterfell. Then she stopped talking. Glover was first. He did not stand to announce that he was about to say something important. He just said it. I'll bear the iron cost from my own stores, 6 frames in 3 weeks. No argument about honor, no reference to the Battle of the Bastards, to the letter he hadn't answered, to the years of calculation that had made him choose wrong and then forced him to live inside that choice. He was a practical man from a practical house, and what Sansa had put in front of him was not a prayer, it was engineering. He could count. He knew what 50 of these things on the hills above a harbor meant for any fleet arriving under dragon cover. The math was obvious, and for once in the North's recent history, someone had walked into a room with a plan. Sansa wrote it down. Lyanna Mormont said, Bear Island can't give you frames. She said it without apology, the way she said everything, flat, direct, already moving past the part where you were supposed to feel bad. Wrong craftsman, wrong timber. What we have is iron ore, more than we can use in 2 winters. She looked down the table at Sansa. Tell me how much you need. Sansa looked at her for a moment. Lyanna looked back without blinking. All of it, Sansa said. Then you'll have all of it. The rest of the lords fell in behind Glover's lead the way northern lords always did when someone moved first. And moved without flinching. The commitments came quickly. Sansa recorded each one and asked 2 clarifying questions per house, timber or iron, smiths or unskilled labor, and moved to the next. 40 minutes and she had production commitments from 9 houses, a material pipeline that could run for 30 days without interruption, and a delivery schedule she would revise tonight when she could do the actual arithmetic properly. Jon said nothing during the meeting. That was the arrangement, never spoken, never formalized, arrived at through 3 months of working alongside each other in a castle that was simultaneously recovering from a siege and preparing for something worse. She ran logistics. He ran men. The lords respected both of them more cleanly for it. The forge ran through the night, organized desperation, moving as fast as it could without moving too fast to hold together. The forge quarter of Winterfell was 3 buildings set around a shared yard, and by midnight all 3 were lit and loud and burning through charcoal at a rate that would have been alarming in any other circumstance. Sansa could hear it from her chamber with the window closed. She opened it. Hot iron and cold air and the sound of hammers working a rhythm that was not quite steady. Tired men lose the beat by degrees, and the men on the night shift had been at it for 7 hours. The smell of tallow from the dip cooling mixed with fresh sawdust from the timber yard next door, where the frame components were being cut to spec under torchlight. An apprentice ran between the two buildings every few minutes, with wrapped components tucked under his arm against the cold, his breath coming in hard white bursts, not slowing down. She stood at the window until the cold made her hands ache. Then she closed it, sat down with her ledger, and kept working. The first throwing arm was done before dawn. They tested it on the slope east of the walls, the rocky hillside face that had served as an archery butt for 100 years. The bolt hit at 600 yards. The sound was enormous and wrong, bigger than it should have been for a machine of that size, a deep crack that rolled back from the stone face and kept traveling, moving out over the wolfswood long after it should have died. Jon was there. Sansa was there. Glover had stayed the night, because Glover was that kind of man. The crew chief loaded a second bolt. The second shot cracked the throwing arm at the tension point. Not a catastrophic failure. The arm held barely, did not shatter. The bolt still flew. But the split was visible from 30 feet away, a white fracture line running 6 inches through the laminate along the grain. The bolt struck the hillside 30 yards left of the first impact, and 30 yards low was a miss. Against a dragon's eye, 30 yards low was a disaster. Glover said nothing. He folded his arms and looked at the crack. Sansa opened her ledger. She asked Tanner, the head smith, a broad, short man of 50, whose hands looked like they'd spent their whole life in a forge because they had, how long before that crack would have been caught in field use? Before an arm failed mid-battle, mid-volley, when there was no time to rebuild it? Tanner looked at the arm. He looked at the crack. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man deciding to be honest about something he didn't want to be honest about. "I don't know, my lady," he said. Sansa wrote 2 lines in the ledger, one below the other. Fix the arm first, count the bolts second. She closed the ledger. The cold was coming off the hillside in slow, steady waves. The crack in the throwing arm was still white against the darker wood around it. The bolt was lodged in the stone face 200 yards from where it needed to be. They rebuilt the arm. 3 days later it held. 3 weeks on the ship had given her time to rehearse. She had stood at the prow in the evenings, after Missandei had gone below and the wind was too cold for conversation, and she had run through it the way she had once run through the words of the Dothraki marriage ceremony before Drogo, silently, precisely, adjusting for the variables she could anticipate and filing away the ones she couldn't. The king in the north would meet her at the dock, or he would make her wait, and either choice would tell her something. He would kneel or he would not, and that would tell her more. She would be gracious regardless. She had rehearsed graciousness until it sat ready in her throat, like a word she knew in several languages. What she had not rehearsed was the hills. The fleet entered the approaches to White Harbor on a gray morning with low cloud and flat water. White Harbor was nothing like Dragonstone, no volcanic rock, no black towers, no sense of something ancient and dangerous thrust up from the sea floor. It was a working port, wide-mouthed, with a harbor wall extending both arms to catch ships, and beyond the harbor wall a city climbing the hillside in stone and gray timber. The people of the city were at the docks. She could see them from the fleet's approach, crowds on the quay, faces turned toward the incoming ships. But the crowds were not on the docks. They were back from the docks, standing at a distance at the edge of the harbor road, in the way of people who have been told to stand there and have chosen to comply because they are curious about what comes next. They were not looking at the fleet. They were looking at the hills. Missandei found her at the prow before they were close enough to see clearly. She said nothing. She stood beside Daenerys and looked at the hills and began to count. The shapes were covered, long shapes on frames, draped in oilcloth the color of dirty snow, each one sitting on a raised position cut into the hillside, with a clear sightline to the harbor. Missandei's lips moved as she counted. She stopped at 40, and Daenerys said, "How many?" "More than 40, Missandei said. "I lost count on the right headland." Drogon banked. She felt it before she understood it. The shift in the air above the fleet, the change in Drogon's shadow as he altered his circling pattern. He had been making the lazy, wide arcs he favored over open water, riding the thermal lift off the sea, indifferent to everything beneath him the way Drogon was always indifferent. Until he wasn't. Now he swung out, away from the harbor mouth. His arc widened until he was holding position 200 yards further from shore than his natural pattern, his wings pushing long, slow strokes, his head low and forward, not fleeing. Drogon did not flee, but something in those oilcloth-covered shapes on the hillside had registered. some smell, iron and old wood, and something beneath those smells that her dragons understood and she did not. And he had decided without being asked that he preferred his distance. Rhaegal, circling off the port quarter, mirrored him within seconds. Neither dragon descended toward the harbor. Both held position over the open water, higher than they had flown on the approach. Daenerys watched them and said nothing. The harbor mouth came up fast after that. Jon Snow was at the dock. She recognized him from the descriptions: dark, compact, a face that had been through something it didn't intend to discuss. He was not in ceremonial dress. He wore the gray wool and black leather of a man who dressed for the cold rather than for occasions, with the direwolf of House Stark on his chest, and nothing Targaryen anywhere on him. No welcoming banner, no silver. Behind his left shoulder, an older man, weathered and careful-eyed, built like someone who had spent his life on ships or near them, and had the kind of stillness that came from knowing what could go wrong. 20 northern soldiers behind both of them. Full armor, parade, rest. Not a guard of honor, a formation. Jon's banner was the direwolf, not a dragon. She had prepared for the possibility that he wouldn't kneel. She had not fully prepared for the way he stood, not defiant, not aggressive, but settled, with the particular quality of a man who has stopped rehearsing because he has decided what he is. He watched her boat make the dock with neither impatience nor performance. He was simply there. She stepped off the gangplank onto northern stone. He moved forward the precise distance required to greet someone of equal standing and stopped. He did not bow. He said, "My queen, the North welcomes you." The pause that followed was long enough for every watching lord and captain and soldier and harbor worker to count it. Long enough for Missandei stepping off the gangplank behind her to take a careful half-step to the side. Long enough for Daenerys to understand that the pause was the message, and that everyone within 40 yards understood the message, and that her response in the next few seconds would either match it or lose something it would be very difficult to recover. She held the pause until it was hers, and then she said, "Lord Snow, not your grace, not the king in the North's title, his name." An equal giving a name. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief. Something cooler than relief. More considered. He was assessing her the same way she was assessing him, and they were both experienced enough at it to recognize what the other was doing. "There is much to discuss," Jon said. "But first." He didn't finish the sentence immediately. He let the words sit. "Your dragons, they'll need to stay at altitude while they're in northern airspace." He held her gaze steadily. "You'll understand why, shortly." He raised his hand. Not a dramatic gesture, just a hand, lifted, deliberate. On the hills above the harbor, simultaneously the oilcloth covers dropped. The sound was wrong. Not a single sound, but 50 sounds arriving at almost the same moment. The slap and billow of heavy cloth falling away from iron frames. And then beneath that sound, the creak and click of throwing arms under tension adjusting to the cold air. And then beneath that nothing. Silence. 50 Dragonbane engines standing exposed on the White Harbor headland, their bolts seated, their crews motionless, their aim points covering every corridor of airspace above the harbor and the harbor mouth and the approaches beyond. Daenerys did not move. The older man behind Jon's shoulder, Davos Seaworth, she would learn the name within the hour, was watching her face. Not unkindly, the way you watch someone receive news you already knew was coming. She looked at the engines. She looked at the crews on them. 2 men per machine, standing still as stone, their hands on the mechanisms. She looked at the arcs of the weapons and calculated, because you could not look at 50 of something without your mind beginning to calculate whether you wanted it to or not. She looked up. Drogon was where he had moved when he first smelled the iron, 200 yards past the harbor mouth, holding altitude, circling. Rhaegal beside him, both of them high, both of them quiet in the way that was not natural for creatures their size over a harbor this close to land. They had already understood what the covers being down meant. They had known before she did. Drogon dropped, not at the harbor, not at the hills. He came down out of his circling arc and landed on the outer breakwater, the long stone arm that extended from the harbor's northern side, wide enough for the harbor watch to walk in pairs, its seaward face battered smooth by years of winter water. He settled onto the stones and folded his wings. The breakwater held him. His claws scraped once against the flat stone, and then stilled. His head was above the parapet, his eyes that burning particular gold, fixed on the harbor, fixed on the engines. He did not roar, he did not breathe. He sat on the stone of White Harbor's breakwater and he waited, because the creatures who flew above him had something pointing at the sky that he did not understand and did not like, and had decided, in the wordless calculation of a thing that had never had reason to be cautious before, to be cautious about now. Rhaegal landed beside him. The breakwater groaned once under the combined weight, and held. Daenerys watched her dragons sit on the harbor stone like sentinels without orders. She thought of Astapor. She thought of young Kai. She thought of every city that had opened its gates or its throat at the sight of the shadows above them. She thought of the confidence that came from knowing, in the center of yourself where the knowing lived, that what flew above you could not be touched. Then she looked at the hills. Lord Snow, she said, and her voice was even because she had been a queen long enough that her voice was always even now, even when everything else was not. I believe you mentioned there was much to discuss. Jon said there is. He turned toward the city. She walked beside him, not behind. Tyrion had seen the corner of the frame before the guards stopped him. One corner. The oilcloth had lifted slightly at the near edge from the wind off the harbor, and what it revealed for 2 seconds before the guard stepped into his path was an ironwood bracket, heavy, precisely cut, with an iron sleeve at the rotation point that showed fresh machining marks. New work. Built in a hurry by someone who knew what they were doing. He had thought about nothing else for the 3 hours between the harbor and this table. He took his seat to Daenerys' left, which was correct, because he was her hand, and he sat to her left and slightly back, in the position that said I am here to advise, not to speak first. He looked at the northern side of the table. Jon Snow at the head, unreadable. Davos Seaworth 2 seats down with the patient face of a man who has survived several things that should have killed him and has made his peace with the world operating that way. And at the far end of the table, in a chair she had clearly chosen for what it allowed her to see, Sansa Stark, who had not spoken since the introductions, and who Tyrion had been watching from the corner of his eye ever since. Sansa Stark was watching the room the way Tyrion watched rooms. He found that interesting. Lord Manderley's great hall smelled of pine resin and old smoke, and the particular damp of a building built for northern weather. The fire at the end of the room was enormous and useless. The cold came under the doors anyway, moved along the floor, found ankles and knees and lower backs regardless of the fire. Tyrion had counted 7 northern lords seated or standing against the walls since he sat down. He had counted the weapons at their belts. He had counted the exits. He had also counted the engines from the harbor window of the room they had been given to change. 53. His initial estimate of 50 had been low. 53. Against 2 living dragons with bonded riders. He had been doing the probability arithmetic since the harbor, and every version of it arrived at the same place, a coordinated volley at close range in a predictable attack corridor during a low-altitude pass. Gave any individual bolt perhaps a 3% chance of finding the unprotected eye. 53 bolts in 4 seconds. He did not like where that arithmetic went. He kept his face neutral and let Daenerys open. She made her case well. She always did. The Targaryen claim, the wheel that had been breaking the realm for centuries, the armies she had brought across the sea, the dragons, which were not weapons but evidence that the world was larger and stranger and more consequential than the lords of Westeros had been willing to admit. She spoke for 8 minutes without notes, without performance, with the particular conviction of a person who has believed the same thing so long it has become indistinguishable from fact. Jon Snow listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "You're right." Daenerys paused. She had not expected agreement. About all of it, Jon said. He put his hands flat on the table, a deliberate gesture, both of them visible, nothing hidden. Your family built the realm, your claim is real, your armies are real, and the Night King does not care about any of it. Then we agree, Daenerys said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something behind it. The slight tightening of a person who has just understood that the agreement has a shape she hasn't seen yet. We agree that the long night is coming, Jon said. We don't yet agree on what that requires. Daenerys leaned forward slightly. It requires my armies. It requires my dragons. Yes, Jon said. It does. He paused. One beat. Come outside. The hillside above the harbor was cleared and cold. A single dragonbane engine sat on the ridge. 2-man crew, both of them very still. The throwing arm was cocked. A bolt was seated, dragon glass tip catching what light there was in the flat gray morning, weirwood laminate strips along the shaft pale as old bone. The target was a rocky outcropping 800 yards down the slope, chest-high, rough-faced, the kind of granite that had been in that hillside since before anyone built anything on this coast. Jon looked at the crew chief and gave him a hand signal. The sound was enormous. Not a whistle or a crack, but a sustained, deep percussion. A sound that lived in the chest cavity rather than the ears. The throw and the transit and the impact arriving so close together that it was almost one event. Almost. The outcropping detonated. A 6-foot section of the granite face sheared clean away and fell, and the sound of it falling was the only sound on the hillside for several seconds. Daenerys stood absolutely still. Beside her, Tyrion's lips moved once, silently. He said it for himself, not for her. Just 2 words. Daenerys heard them anyway. "That's the eye," Tyrion said. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The rock dust was still settling 800 yards down the slope, a slow gray dispersal in the still air. The crew chief began reloading with the practiced efficiency of men who had been doing this for 3 weeks. Daenerys turned back to the hall without speaking. Inside, the air was heavier. Sansa Stark spoke for the first time. She had let Jon open. She had let the demonstration do the next part. Now she sat forward in her chair and put a piece of parchment on the table. Not the manuscript, not Maester Wolkin's sketches, but a clean document in a clear hand. And she spoke as if she were reading a supply inventory. "The North will not kneel," she said. "That is not a demand. It is a condition of geography. The North has been independent longer than the Targaryen line has existed." She did not say this as an insult. She said it as arithmetic. "Your forces fight alongside ours against the Night King. Not for us. For every living thing in this world, because that is what is actually at stake." She looked at Daenerys. "You already understand that. So does your hand." Tyrion looked at the table. He offered nothing. "The Dragonbane design remains Northern property," Sansa continued. "It is not a negotiating point. It does not transfer." She paused one moment. "In exchange, the North provides full logistical support. Food stores, fortification access, supply lines, local knowledge, garrison coordination. Your armies eat, your dragons fly under agreed rules of engagement." Daenerys said, "Agreed rules of engagement." She said it flat, each word given equal weight, the way you repeat something back to test whether it sounds as unreasonable aloud as it did when you heard it. "You are proposing to tell me where my dragons may fly." "I am proposing a coalition," Sansa said. "In a coalition, both parties agree to conditions. That is what makes it a coalition rather than a surrender." The fire at the end of the room had burned down somewhat. The cold under the doors was creeping across the floor, slow and patient, the way the cold in the North did everything, without urgency because it had all the time in the world. Daenerys looked at Jon. "Is this your offer, Lord Snow, or your sister's?" "It's the North's offer," Jon said. "And the dragon's rules of engagement, altitude and engagement corridors agreed in advance. Your riders have final authority in active combat. You have full autonomy against the dead." Jon held her eyes. "Against anything else, we talk first." Daenerys said with a precision that had a blade running under it, "And if I decline?" Jon said, "Then we fight the Night King with what we have, and we lose, and in 2 years there is nothing left to argue the terms of." The room went very quiet. Tyrion leaned forward. He spoke the way he always spoke when the situation required it. Not as the hand of the queen, not with the performance of official weight, but as a man thinking aloud in a room full of people who were smart enough to hear where the thinking led. "Your Grace." He looked at Daenerys carefully. 3 choices. Reject the terms and spend the next 6 months demonstrating that your dragons can't be used as freely as you thought, which cost you allies you cannot replace. Accept them and walk into the long night with the strongest military alliance in the 7 kingdoms behind you. Or wait, and let the Night King simplify the decision. He picked up his cup, looked at it, set it down again. The second option produces a living queen. I have a preference for living queens. They're easier to advise. Daenerys looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Sansa, at Jon, at the parchment on the table. She reached for it. They did not kneel. Either of them. Jon extended his hand, Northern style, flat, direct, the handshake of 2 commanders who have found the same objective from different directions. Daenerys looked at the hand for 1 beat. Then she took it. There was no ceremony to it, no lords cheering, no banners raised. The Northern lords against the walls watched without expression. Missandei, standing behind Daenerys' chair, let out a breath so carefully controlled it was almost nothing. Daenerys' grip was firm and quick. She released. She said, "You are the first man to threaten my children and still breathe, Jon Snow." There was something in it that was not quite anger and not quite admiration. something that occupied the space between them, complicated and unresolved. "I have not yet decided whether that makes you very foolish or very impressive," Jon said. "Whichever it is, we have a war to fight." She stood at the window of the room they had given her long after the hall had emptied. The harbor was quiet, the fleet rode dark at anchor. Drogon and Rhaegal were somewhere above. She could feel them the way she always felt them, a warmth at the back of her chest like a coal that didn't go out, present even when they were too high to see. She reached for it. They were circling. They were always circling when she was inside a building, but lower than before. She could not name what she felt standing at the window of this cold northern room with the Dragonbane engines invisible in the dark on the hillside, and her dragons flying lower than they used to fly. It was not defeat. She had not been defeated. She had agreed to a coalition on terms that were arguably reasonable and demonstrably necessary. It was something else. The cold came off the window glass and settled across her face. She stood there until she understood. And what she understood was this: she had spent 3 years being the kind of power that did not need to be careful. The dragons were the argument. The dragons were the end of every conversation before the conversation finished. She had built herself inside that certainty the way you build a house inside walls, not noticing the walls because the walls were the point. The walls had changed shape. She turned from the window, outside moving in slow circles at an altitude they had chosen rather than being forced to. Her dragons kept flying, lower than before, but still flying. She held on to that. The cruise rotated every 4 hours. Not because Jon preferred it, because beyond 4 hours in the open air at these temperatures, a man's hands stopped being reliable. The fingers worked, but the dexterity didn't. The small, precise movements required to load a bolt and seat it and operate the release lever correctly required a hand that could feel what it was touching. After 4 hours, in the kind of cold that had settled over Winterfell in the last 2 weeks, you had hands that could grip but couldn't discriminate. A fumbled release in a coordinated volley wasn't a mistake. It was a dead man, and possibly the man beside him. Jon knew this because he had spent 14 nights on the walls of Castle Black, and because the crew chiefs had told him, and because he had stood beside the northwest pit position on the 4th night of the repositioning, and watched the outgoing crew's hands shake during changeover, and understood immediately that 4 hours was not a ceiling they had invented to be cautious, but a fact they had discovered by testing. He walked the positions every night, not to check on the crews. The crew chiefs were capable men, and checking on capable men was a way of telling them they were not, but because he needed to know every position by body memory before the night it mattered. The spacing between the snow pit covers, the distance from the 3rd northwest pit to the wall, the exact angle of the wall scorpion brackets at full elevation, and what they looked like from 50 yards out, and what Viserion would see if it came in low from the northeast on a banking run. He slept 3 hours a night for 2 weeks, and felt it in the way he had felt the long watches at the wall, not as tiredness exactly, but as a kind of slow narrowing, the world compressing to the essential things and the non-essential things falling away without drama. Bran told him it would be before dawn. He didn't say how he knew. Jon didn't ask. The forest went dark at the 4th hour past midnight, not the natural dark of a clouded sky or a dying fire, the dark of something covering the light from the tree line outward, the small ambient glow of snow under starlight simply stopping, as if the wolfswood had decided to stop reflecting. The scouts on the northern wall saw it first. The signal came down the wall in the northern fashion, a single strike on the iron bell at the northwest corner post, not rung, just struck once with a hammerhead. One tone, clean and brief. Jon heard it from the inner yard and was moving before the echo died. The cold changed as he climbed the wall. Not colder, the temperature had been fixed for hours, deep and stable and past the point where it could feel worse. What changed was the direction of it. The wind, which had been cutting from the northwest all night, stopped completely. The air went still in the way that air does not naturally go still, not calming, not settling, but stopping, as if something upstream had simply decided that the wind was no longer useful and turned it off. The stillness was the worst of it. Jon stood on the northern wall above the main gate and looked out over the killing ground. The snow pit covers were invisible from this angle. That was the point. The crew chiefs would have their hands on the release pulls by now, their eyes on the sky, their breathing controlled in the way that men who have waited a long time for something breathe when the waiting is almost over. He heard them before he saw them, or felt them. The distinction stopped mattering after a few seconds because the sound was less a sound than a pressure, something between sound and sensation, felt in the chest and in the back of the jaw, a grinding undertone that had no single source. It came from everywhere the dark reached. The tree line moved, not the trees. The dark within the trees, reorganizing, pressing forward, filling in the space between trunks with bodies that had no warmth and made no breath clouds in air cold enough that anything living would have been exhaling white steam with every step. Nothing, nothing, nothing. Then Viserion crossed the wall. Bran's eyes had been white for 6 hours. Sam had checked twice. The frost on Bran's left hand had moved up past the second knuckle on 2 fingers. His breathing was so shallow it was nearly nothing. The chair beneath him was the only warm surface in the godswood, body heat conducting through the wood, barely just enough to be measurable if you put your hand beside his shoulder without touching. Bran was not in the godswood. He was somewhere north. He had been north for 6 hours, finding the approach in the slow, careful way you approach something that would destroy you if it noticed you too soon. Not into Viserion's mind. What was left of Viserion's mind was not a dragon's any longer, was not hot and vast and aggressive in the way a living dragon's mind was, the furnace that had killed Varamir when he reached too far. What was in Viserion now was the Night King's signal, a wire, taut and cold, running from the hill north of Winterfell to the thing in the sky above it. Bran was not trying to cut the wire. He was trying to put his thumb on it. 3 seconds, enough to make it vibrate differently, enough for the signal to stutter. He found it the moment Viserion crossed the north wall. 3 seconds. Viserion dropped, not falling, dipping, as if the angle of the wing beat had shifted fractionally and the wing beat was wrong for level flight. The neck swung left. The blue light behind the teeth, which had been building through the descent for a strike at the wall's midsection, guttered. Then the Night King corrected. The wire went taut again. Viserion's head came up and the wing beat began to reestablish and the angle of the banking run started to resolve back toward the wall. 8 wall scorpions fired first. Then, in the 2-second stagger that the crew chiefs had drilled for, 12 pit covers blew simultaneously and 12 pit scorpions fired from positions that had been invisible 4 seconds ago. 20 bolts in the air at the same time. 3 missed the dragon entirely, high and left, cutting through empty air, falling somewhere in the dark to the north, with enough velocity to bury themselves 6 inches into frozen ground. 7 struck the underscales and fell away. The scales did what dragon scales do. The bolts skidded and deflected, punching through in part, not in full, leaving wounds that would have grounded a horse and meant nothing to a creature this size. 2 punched through the left wing membrane, the thin tissue between the finger bones of the wing, unscaled, stretched taut in flight. The bolts went through cleanly. The holes they left were ragged and dark. The Syrian's left wing compensated. Not enough to go down, not yet. 1 bolt, from the 3rd pit on the northwest approach, struck the joint, the junction of the left wing and the shoulder, where the membrane attached to the body, where the deep muscle drove the whole mechanism of flight. The bolt hit square and drove deep, weirwood laminate and dragonglass tip and steel ferrule together, and the joint did what joints do when something drives into them at that velocity. The wing collapsed. A wing collapse is not a fall. It is a controlled disaster. The aircraft that was a living creature suddenly being an object, a mass, a problem of physics, with no pilot and no correction available. The Syrian's right wing compensated for half a second, which was enough to turn the vertical fall into a glide, which was enough to carry the mass 200 yards before the momentum ran out. It hit the northern field at an angle. The impact rewrote the landscape of the northern approach in under a second, frozen earth erupting in a radius that threw 2 crew chiefs off their feet inside the nearest snow pit. The concussive wave moving out from the contact point in a ring that Jon felt through the soles of his boots on the wall 30 yards above the field. The blue fire went uncontrolled. Viserion's neck swung as it hit, and the jaw opened, and what came out was not aimed and not controlled, and not cold in the way of something structural failing. A pressure release, enormous, spreading in a wall across the northern field at the angle of the neck's last arc. Blue light that burned like acid and stuck like pitch, and did not behave the way fire was supposed to behave. 40 men. They were in the field because they were supposed to be. Their position was correct. They had done nothing wrong. The bolt from the 3rd northwest pit had hit the joint and brought the dragon down 200 yards past the point of the trajectory model. 200 yards, the margin between the landing zone and the nearest crew position. 40 men in a wall of cold blue light that turned the northern field white for 3 seconds. Then dark. Viserion lay in the wreckage of the earth it had made. Not dead, not yet. the blue fire still venting in irregular bursts from the damaged wing side, the claws sunk deep into the frozen ground, the neck moving in the slow, disoriented sweep of a creature that had lost the signal and not yet understood what that meant. But on the ground, the Night King stood on the hill a quarter-mile north of the wall. He had stood there since the army arrived, which was the position he always occupied, elevated, behind the front at the point of maximum visibility. He had directed battles from positions like this one, across distances and seasons and centuries that no living commander had experienced, and the patterns of open warfare had never required him to change his approach mid-engagement. Until now. He stood on the hill and looked at the field, his dragon on the ground, the scorpion positions visible now, the covers thrown back, the crews already reloading, the wall scorpions tracking on their iron brackets, the throwing arms resetting in coordinated sequence, the crew chiefs calling adjustments in the dark. He looked at all of it. The army of the dead below him was perfectly still. They did not fidget or shift or make the 1,000 unconscious movements that living soldiers made during a pause in contact. They waited with absolute patience, because patience was not something they experienced. It was simply the state of things without orders. The Night King looked at the field for a long time. Then he turned, not away, north, slightly north of where he'd been standing, toward a different corridor of approach, toward a section of the killing ground that the scorpion positions, arrayed for the expected frontal assault, did not cover in the same density. He had used the dragon as his first move. He had done it because it had always been enough, because there had never been a wall he could not bring down and never a force that could make the loss of a dragon a recoverable error rather than a final one. The army of the dead reorganized. No command, no sound. Just a slow, perfect, terrible rearrangement of a force that did not tire and did not doubt and did not have to be told twice. The Night King walked north, and the dark moved with him. And he began again. The ground between the wall and the landing site was wrong. What had been the northern approach field an hour ago? Flat, packed, the killing ground that crew chiefs had walked and measured and mapped over 3 weeks of preparation was not flat anymore. The impact had rewritten it. Craters where the claw strikes had landed during the last wing beats, an eruption ridge of frozen earth, 40 yards long where the chest had hit and plowed before the momentum stopped. The blue fire had burned channels into the permafrost that steamed faintly in the cold air, white vapor rising from black ground, and those channels crossed every approach route they had planned. Jon looked at the field from the depression, revised. The depression was natural, a low fold in the ground left by runoff from the wall's drainage, shallow enough that a standing man could see over it, deep enough that a prone man could not be seen. He and his squad of 6 were prone, all of them, faces against the frozen ground, breathing carefully, listening to Viserion before they looked at Viserion, because you wanted to know the rhythm of it before you moved. The rhythm was wrong. A grounded dragon in control of itself breathed in a pattern, chest expanding, neck moving in coordinated sweeps, claws shifting with purpose. What Viserion was doing was not coordinated. The chest heaved in irregular bursts. The neck swept wide left, then wide right, not tracking a target but searching, the head moving in the heavy, confused arc of something that had lost its signal and not yet found it again. The blue fire vented in those same irregular bursts, not aimed, not building, not the controlled long breath of a weapon being deployed, but the pressure release of a machine cycling without direction. The Night King was still correcting, still finding the wire. Jon said, very quietly, now. Donnell went left with Ghost. He was the fastest runner in the squad, and Jon had told him exactly one thing during the planning. Don't let the head come back right until I'm at the eye. Donnell had nodded without asking questions, which was why Jon had chosen him. Ghost was already moving past the left edge of the depression, his white shape barely visible against the snow. Dark enough to be wrong, light enough to seem like something the eye should be able to dismiss. A wolf, low and fast at the periphery. Viserion's head tracked left. Jon was moving before the head finished turning. The lance was heavier than he remembered from the carrying. It was always heavier than you remembered. 8 feet of weirwood laminate over ironwood, the steel ferrule adding a pound at the forward end, the dragon glass tip narrowing from palm width to needle point at the very tip, the whole assembly designed to be driven by 2 men's weight and momentum rather than thrown. You ran it home. You used yourself as the mechanism. Precision at contact range, not standoff distance, because the eye socket was small and the angle mattered, and a thrown weapon at contact range was a weapon with no control. In its last 2 feet, Harwick had the rear grip, a head taller than Jon, the kind of broad that came from 15 years of forge work rather than fighting. Jon had chosen him because the lance needed mass in the push, and Harwick had mass. He ran 3 steps back, his hands on the grip, his breathing loud and steady, not the controlled breathing of a trained fighter, but the straightforward, determined breathing of a man who had decided to do a thing and was doing it. 20 yards, 15, the neck started coming back right. The head turned, and the blue fire turned with it, and Malin, running left flank, 12 feet off Jon's shoulder, caught the edge. Not the full cone. The edge, blue light that hit the back of his left leg and didn't stop when it hit, didn't bounce or splash or dissipate the way normal fire did. It stuck. It spread from the contact point with a purposefulness that was wrong, moving against gravity, climbing, and Malin made a single short sound that Jon would hear for a long time afterward, and went down. Jon kept running. 10 yards, 8, the tail came from nowhere. A lateral impact against his right side. Not a blow exactly, more like being hit by a wall that was also moving. It caught Harwick square. The sound of it was bad. Harwick went left, and the rear grip went with him, and the lance was suddenly Jon's alone. 9 feet of weight with only 1 set of hands on it, the momentum wrong, the angle already drifting. 6 yards. 4. The head came around fast, faster than something this size should move. The neck extended, and the jaw opened, and the blue fire was not a vent this time, but a breath. Aimed, the Night King back on the wire, and the first of it caught Jon's left forearm. It did not feel like fire. It felt like something grabbing, cold that burned, not the sensation of heat that flame produced, but cold that destroyed anyway, eating through the sleeve and into the skin beneath, and not coming off, not responding to the instinct to pull away from it, spreading with that same purposeful wrongness toward the elbow. He hit the ground and rolled. Snow. He needed snow. The permafrost packed against the blue light, and for 2 full seconds nothing changed, and then it went out. Not extinguished, not washed away, but starved, the frozen ground pulling something from it that fire needed, and the blue light needed whatever fire needed, and without it the burning stopped. He lay in the snow for 1 second. His left arm was bad. He stood up. 3 yards. The eye was closed, the protective membrane down, the response of a creature that sensed something close. Jon drove the lance underhand, using his body weight from the shoulder, right arm bearing the full load, left hand on the shaft not for grip, but for direction. The burned forearm doing what he told it even though it screamed doing it. The membrane was thinner than scale, thicker than skin. The needle point went through. He drove his hips forward, both feet pushing into the frozen earth, right arm extending until his shoulder was fully rotated, adding every inch of reach he had, and the weirwood shaft flexed slightly under the load, not enough to fail, not the crack that had split the first test arm on the hillside outside Winterfell, and the dragon glass tip drove through the membrane and into the socket beneath. The dragon glass met the Night King's binding and severed it. Not the Night King himself. He was still on the hill, still standing, still alive. But the specific thread of his will that ran into Viserion, that had animated the dead dragon and held it and directed it across every mile of the march south, that thread, meeting dragon glass, simply ceased, the way a flame ceased when the wick was gone. Not fought, not overcome, removed at the point of contact, cleanly because dragon glass did not negotiate with the magic of the long night. It ended it. Viserion made no sound, no roar, no shriek. The sounds dragons made when they were hurt were sounds of something choosing to express itself, and what was left in Viserion was no longer making choices. What happened instead was silence, immediate and total, as if someone had lifted a needle from a record and the music simply stopped. The fire stopped first. The blue light behind the jaw was there, and then it wasn't. Not dimming, not guttering. Gone between 1 second and the next, the way a candle went out in a hard wind, then the neck came down. Not falling, settling, the weight of it moving in the slow way of something losing the organization that had been holding it up. The massive neck lowered until the jaw rested in the frozen earth with a sound like stone on stone. Then the claws, each one uncurling separately, the tension leaving them in sequence, the permafrost releasing as they opened, 6 inches of frozen soil coming up with each claw, dark and strange beneath, and then those 2 settling. The claws lying open in the snow, like hands that had let go of something they had been holding for a very long time. The mass of it remained. 200 tons of dead dragon on the northern field, still cooling, the scales along the flank releasing the last warmth they had stored. Steam rising from the body in thin columns that went straight up in the windless air. Jon pulled the lance free. He dropped it. He sat down against the flank. The dragon's side was warm against his back. Not hot. Whatever heat the undead thing had carried was leaving fast, the cold of the field winning at a rate he could feel through his coat, but warm enough for now, in this minute, to matter. He put his right hand in his lap. He placed his left arm across his knee with the burned side up and did not look at it. His breathing slowed. Ghost came around the tail. He came low and deliberate, the way he moved when he was reading a new environment, nose working the air ahead of each step, pausing once at Malin's position without Jon seeing what he found there, moving on. He found Jon in under 2 minutes. He stood 3 feet away and read the situation in the complete unhurried way that Ghost read situations. Then he sat, not against Jon. Beside him, Jon said nothing. Ghost said nothing. They sat beside the dead dragon in the northern field while the battle continued on the other side of the wall, the sound of it carrying in the windless cold, the iron bells on the east wall, the deep percussion of a scorpion volley somewhere to the northeast, men's voices stripped by distance into pure sound without words. Jon did not feel like a dragon slayer. He felt like a man sitting in the snow with a burned arm and 2 dead men somewhere in the field behind him. He felt the weight of the lance on the ground 3 feet to his right, and the warmth leaving the flank behind him, degree by degree, and the cold coming up through the frozen earth into his legs. He looked at Ghost. Ghost looked back. Jon got up. The Night King had not moved from the hill. Same position since the army arrived, elevated, behind the front, at the point of maximum visibility. He was looking at the field, at the dead dragon lying in the wreckage it had made, at the scorpion positions with their covers thrown back and their crews reloading, at the wall brackets tracking on their iron pivots in the torchlight. He stood for a long time. No expression moved across his face. He did not rage. He did not mourn the dragon that had been his, or had been a dragon once before it became his. He simply looked at the new shape of the field and at the seams in the coverage that the scorpion positions created, the corridors where the overlapping fields of fire thinned, where a force willing to absorb losses could move without being caught inside a coordinated volley. He had never had to find the seam before. He was finding it now. The army of the dead reorganized beneath him, perfectly, silently, no command, no signal, no sound of any kind passing between the bodies shifting their formation in the dark. They moved the way water moved, into the available space, along the available channels, without ego and without error and without the 1,000 inefficiencies that living soldiers brought to the problem of movement at night in broken terrain. The Night King turned north, the dark moved with him, and he began again. The message came in 3 pieces. This was standard for intelligence of this sensitivity. The same content sent through 3 separate relay chains, each taking a different route, so that if one carrier was intercepted or delayed or simply lost in the chaos of a continent at war, 2 others still arrived. Qyburn had designed the system himself. He understood its implications. Anything important enough to send 3 times was important enough to make him nervous about what it contained before he had assembled the pieces. He assembled them alone in the rookery in the hour before dawn, with the ravens restless in their cages and the smell of bird and old straw thick in the cold air. He had sent the duty maester out. The maester had not argued. Maesters who argued with Qyburn tended to find their duties reassigned to the parts of the Red Keep that no one wanted to go. He read it once. He set it down. He looked at the wall for a long time, not at anything on the wall, but through it, at the space behind his eyes where calculations lived. He went to the door and called the maester back. The second paragraph, Qyburn said, "Read it to me." The maester read it. His voice was admirably steady for a man who had just read that the Night King's resurrected dragon had been brought down by coordinated ballista fire from concealed positions across a prepared killing ground, that Jon Snow had killed the grounded dragon personally with a dragonglass lance, that Daenerys Targaryen's surviving dragons had been present throughout the engagement and had remained at altitude, inside an agreed corridor, without making a single attack run. Remained at altitude. Qyburn dismissed the maester and went to his workshop. His own scorpion drawings were on the 3rd shelf. He pulled them. He spread them on the central table under good lamplight and looked at them with the particular attention of a man who has been proud of something and is now required to be honest about it. The Qyburn scorpion was a capable design. It had hit Drogon in the reach, which no weapon in recorded history had done before. Bronn had fired it from an almost stationary position at close range, and the bolt had penetrated scale and buried itself in muscle deep enough to require Daenerys' attention to remove. He had been proud of that. He looked at the drawings for an hour. He picked up a pen and made 3 notes in the margin. Then he looked at the notes. Range. The Q-burn Scorpion had been designed for a single devastating shot at a target in a predictable position. The concealed pit design described in the intelligence report, pre-aimed fixed kill zones, the cover deploying in under 3 seconds, was a fundamentally different tactical concept. His Scorpion was a single archer. What the North had built was a volley. Coordination. His design had no mechanism for synchronized firing across multiple units. The intelligence described 8 wall scorpions and 12 pit scorpions releasing inside 4 seconds. 4 seconds. That required signal doctrine, crew training, and a coordination system that his single-unit design had never required and had never been built to support. The 3rd note he wrote and then stopped. Dragonglass. The bolt tip. He sat with that for a long time. Qyburn worked alone until the 2nd hour past midnight. He had pinned a clean sheet of parchment to the sloping surface beside the window, and had been sketching, not the outer geometry of what the Northern Scorpion probably looked like, but the throwing arm. Just the arm. The laminate configuration as he understood it from the intelligence. The stress points, the places where a conventional wood arm would begin to fail after repeated high-load cycling, and the places where a second material with different grain and different flex tolerance would compensate. He drew it carefully. He understood materials. He understood stress and tension and the physics of things being pushed to their limit, and either holding or not holding. He looked at the drawing. He picked up his pen and wrote 3 words at the bottom of the page. He set the pen down. He looked at the words. The lamp burned low beside him, and the city outside was quiet. And the 3 words were the most honest thing he had written in years. And there was no one in the room to read them, and he did not cross them out. He covered the drawing with a blank sheet. He went to bed. He had been counting for 3 days. Not the soldiers. He had a count of soldiers from the manifest Jon's quartermaster maintained, updated each night and available each morning if you knew which adjutant to ask. Not the wagons or the horses, or the Dothraki riding in a loose parallel column 100 yards east, who had been making the King's Road uncomfortable for every cart driver who caught sight of them unexpectedly. He had counts of all those things. He was counting the engines, the spacing, the coverage arcs. He was riding in the middle of the column on a horse he had not chosen but had been assigned. Northern stock, broad-backed, built for cold, with the heavy legs of an animal designed to keep going rather than to be elegant about it. And he was calculating, as he had been calculating since White Harbor, the specific geometry of what the Northern March represented. 53 dragon-baying engines distributed across a column 12 miles long, in groups of 5, with 200-yard spacing between groups. The spacing was not arbitrary. It was the minimum distance at which a coordinated volley from 2 adjacent groups could cover the same corridor of airspace without the outer machines on one group being redundant with the inner machines on the next. Overlap without waste. A moving killing field that followed the column wherever it went. He had worked this out on the 3rd day because it annoyed him not to understand it. Understanding it made him feel only slightly better about being inside it. Above the column, Drogon and Rhaegal held their circuits. Higher than they had flown over open water on the transit south. Higher than Tyrion had watched them fly over Meereen, where they had come in low above the Great Pyramid with the loose ownership of creatures who understood the city below them as territory. The difference in altitude was not subtle. They rode the thermals above 300 feet and stayed there, and when Daenerys signaled them for exercises, the runs began and terminated above the line. 300 feet. The altitude band Tyrion and Jon had drawn on a map in a tent 2 weeks ago, by lamplight over a shared cup of Dornish red that neither of them had requested but both of them needed. Jon had drawn the line at 300 feet because below it the engines tracked. Above it, they held neutral. Not because 300 feet was inherently safe. A bolt from a wall scorpion carried effective force past 800 yards, and 300 feet was under 300 yards, and Tyrion had done that arithmetic before Jon finished the sentence. But above 300 feet, accuracy degraded. The angle of fire against a moving target at altitude introduced variables that compounded quickly, and the dragons above 300 feet were degraded in equal measure. Close air support required low-altitude precision, and low-altitude precision required coming down, and coming down meant crossing the line. The constraint was not a command. It was physics. He had explained this to Daenerys privately, in the language she received best. Not restriction, but calculation. Above 300 feet, he had told her, the engines are not aimed at your dragons. Below 300 feet they are. Your riders have full autonomy and active combat against the dead. Against everything else, the line holds. He had paused. This is not a cage. A cage prevents entry. The line establishes a specific altitude during a specific type of engagement. She had said, at altitude, he had said, at altitude, yes. She had looked at him for a long time. He had held the look without filling it, because filling it would have made him wrong about something important. She had not argued. Missandei found him on the third evening, which surprised him. She was walking the column's eastern edge in the hour before camp was made, the habit of a woman who thought better moving than sitting. She fell into step beside his horse with the coordinated ease of someone who had been intending to find him for longer than the encounter suggested. How far do they track, she said. No preamble. Looking at the nearest engine group, 5 frames on their wagons, crews riding the carts, throwing arms, secured for transport, 250 yards effective at altitude, Tyrion said. Beyond that, the angle degrades faster than the crews can adjust for a moving target. You measured this. I calculated it and confirmed with the crew chief of the 7th group, who was kind enough to explain the correction tables they use for crosswind at range. He paused. I have been thorough. Missandei was quiet for a moment. The column moved around them, soldiers, carts, unsullied in their formations, the particular sound of a large force on a road, not built for a force this large. She stood at her window for 2 hours last night, Missandei said, after camp was made. Tyrion said nothing. She does that when something is wrong, Missandei said. Not wrong in the way of a problem to be solved. Wrong in the way of something that has changed and cannot be unchanged. The engine group passed on its wagon. The crew chief, a northern man of 50 with the patient face of someone who had made his peace with iron, glanced down at Tyrion without expression and looked back at the road. She will be all right, Tyrion said. Missandei did not answer. They walked in silence until the column curved south around a stand of bare Riverlands elms, and Missandei turned back, and Tyrion rode on alone with the sound of the engines behind him. He had the conversation he had been building toward on the 6th evening. Jon was in the command tent after the staff had gone, looking at maps the way he always looked at maps after briefings, not for new information but for confirmation, checking routes he already knew against the paper to catch discrepancies before they became problems on the road. His mug of something hot sat untouched beside his right hand. Tyrion sat across from him without being invited. Jon did not comment on this. Walk me through the coordination signal, Tyrion said. Jon looked up. The synchronized firing, 8 wall scorpions and 12 pit scorpions inside 4 seconds. That requires a signal. I want to understand the signal. Jon held his look for a moment. Then he described it. The iron bell on the northwest corner post, struck once for the initial warning, struck twice for the command fire, wall scorpions on the first bell too, pit crews on the second bell too, the stagger built into the timing by the physical distance between the bell post and the nearest pit position. 2 seconds between the wall volley and the pit volley, Tyrion said. Why 2 seconds? 1 second wasn't enough. The downward pressure of the wall bolts leaving the throwing arms interfered with the pit trajectory on the first test run. 2 seconds let the air settle. Tyrion absorbed this, made a note. Jon watched him write. Why? Tyrion set the pen down. He looked at the map, then at Jon with the attention he reserved for things he had decided to say before he had fully decided how. Because I am going to recommend that every castle in the 7 kingdoms gets one of these. He said it the way he said most important things, without theater, without preparation, as if confirming something already agreed. Every major seat, the great houses, the principal secondary seats, and to make that argument to the person who least wants to hear it, I need to understand it well enough to answer every question she raises before she raises it. Jon was quiet. You think she'll resist it, Jon said. I think she will have every rational reason to resist it, and every personal reason to resist it, plus the additional difficulty of pride, which is neither rational nor negligible in any human being. Tyrion picked up his mug. Cold. He drank it anyway, and I think I can make the argument. But the argument requires that I understand what I'm recommending well enough that the technical questions become settled before she reaches them. He looked at the map. Tell me about the bolt geometry. Jon looked at him for a long moment. Then he described the bolt geometry, the narrow tip, the widening behind the point, the principle of lodging rather than passing through, the steel ferrule that kept the dragonglass head from shattering against the orbital bone if the angle was slightly off. He described it the way he described everything, without decoration, in the order it happened, giving Tyrion what he needed rather than what sounded impressive. Tyrion wrote it all down. They sat in the tent until the lamp burned low, and Jon talked about the weapons he had built, and Tyrion listened in a way that he had almost forgotten how to do. Daenerys rode to the front of the column on the 8th morning, alone, ahead of her guard. She rode along the eastern edge where the nearest engine group was visible on its wagon, and she looked at it as she passed. The throwing arm, the bolt seated in the channel, the iron bracket at the rotation point machined to a tolerance that her own blacksmiths in Essos could have matched but had never been asked to. The crew chief looked back at her. He did not salute. He was a northern man and she was not his queen. He looked at her the way you looked at something you had been told about and were now encountering at close range, with the steady attention of a craftsman evaluating another craftsman's work. No hostility in it, no deference either. She rode past without speaking. Above her, Drogon banked at altitude, a wide, slow turn that caught the morning light along his scales in a way that was briefly and completely beautiful. He was very high. His shadow on the riverlands below was small. She reached for the warmth at the back of her chest where he lived, and found him there, present and unhurried, circling in long arcs above the tree line. He had stopped descending 3 days into the march, not because she had told him to, not because the bond between them had carried some instruction she had sent consciously. He had simply stopped crossing the line, and she had felt it happen in the way she felt everything that happened with her dragons, not as a thought, but as a fact, arriving without announcement. He had assessed the ground below him and the machines on that ground, and had made a decision in whatever way dragons made decisions. She had felt him learning. The riverlands spread in front of the column, flat and gray-green and bare, the winter trees skeletal against a low sky, abandoned farmsteads at the road's edge where families had gone somewhere safer and not yet come back. The land that armies moved through and didn't stop in. A group of riders appeared on the road from the east. 6 of them. Old cloth. The banner they carried was the Tully trout, faded at the edges, the dye gone uneven from weather and too much time spent rolled rather than flying. The banner of men who had been living inside an occupation long enough that their colors showed the years of it. They pulled up at the road's edge and waited. The column reached them. The lead rider looked at the engines. He looked at the sky above the column, at the 2 enormous shapes circling at altitude. He looked at the engines again. He turned his horse and fell in beside the column without speaking. The others followed. The column moved around them and kept going south. 12 miles of men and machines and ancient grievances, and 2 dragons learning to be careful, all of it moving together toward whatever King's Landing was going to be. The engines arrived before the light did. The garrison on the northern wall saw them in the last dark before dawn, shapes resolving out of the black into something that had weight and height and the particular quality of things that had been placed rather than grown. By the time the sky had gone from black to gray, the shapes were defined. 50 dragonbane engines in a half-circle across the northern approaches, sitting on the high ground outside the range of the Lannister scorpions on the wall, their throwing arms cocked, their bolt channels loaded, their crews standing beside them in the cold without moving. The garrison stood on the walls and looked at them. Above the column, Drogon and Rhaegal circled at 1,500 feet. At 1,500 feet, they were shapes, not creatures, the scale of them only apparent when a wing beat carried one across the pale disk of the rising sun, and for a moment the silhouette blocked it entirely. The men on the walls looked up and looked down and looked at the engines, and made the calculation that any fighting man makes when he looks at a field and counts the weapons on it. No orders came from below to advance. The northern host stood in its formation and waited. Jaime had been awake for 3 of the 4 nights since the column arrived. The 4th night he slept 2 hours, which was worse than not sleeping. He came out of it in the middle of a dream that he didn't remember upon waking, knowing only that it had been loud, and lay in the dark beside Cersei, who was breathing in the shallow, even pattern of someone who was not asleep, but was performing it. He had not told her about the dream. He lay there and thought about Aerys. He had never stopped thinking about Aerys. 20 years of being called Kingslayer, and he had thought about Aerys every time, every variation of the name, every curl of the lip from every lord who thought a man who broke his oath to his king deserved to carry the breaking publicly forever. He had thought about the moment he drove the blade in. Not the decision. He had made that in under a second and there had been nothing complicated about it, but the moment itself, the way Aerys went, the way the throne room went quiet. He had killed a king to stop him burning the city. He lay in the dark beside Cersei and thought about the wildfire caches she had marked on a map 4 days ago, in this room, standing at the table with the map between them, and her voice completely controlled as she explained the contingency, the locations, the messenger she had ready, the specific phrase the messenger would carry. He had not argued. He had been arguing for 3 nights in his own head instead, and the argument always arrived at the same destination, and the destination was the same destination it had been 20 years ago in a throne room with a mad king screaming "burn them all." The destination did not change because the people changed. The destination was the city. He got up quietly. The Old Gate commander was a man named Harlan who had served under Tywin at the Blackwater and had the face of someone who had seen enough in his life to have developed strong opinions about the actions of men in positions of power. He was standing at his post, which was where Jaime expected to find him at 4 a.m. He was the kind of man who was always at his post. Jaime stood in front of him in the dark corridor below the gate mechanism and said nothing for a moment. He was working out how to say the thing that needed saying in a way that transferred the decision cleanly. Because this could not be an order. An order could be traced. An order was Jaime's name on something permanent. It needed to be a fact. He said, "The Queen intends to burn the city." Harlan looked at him. "Before she surrenders it," Jaime said, "she has the locations prepared and the messenger ready, tonight or tomorrow, depending on how the northern push develops." He paused. "I am telling you this because you are the commander of the Old Gate, and because you served under Tywin, and because my father understood that preserving the city was the first obligation of anyone who held it." Harlan said nothing. His face was doing several things at once and controlling all of them. "I am not giving you an order," Jaime said. Harlan held his eyes for a long moment. He said, "I'll need 2 minutes to clear the mechanism." Jaime said, "Take 3. He walked back toward the keep without looking at the gate. The gates opened 40 minutes before dawn. Not all the gates. The Old Gate, the secondary northern entrance, narrower than the main approach, used historically for supply convoys rather than army movements. It was enough. Jon Snow's advance guard had been in position since the second night, which meant they had been sitting in the cold for 36 hours waiting for exactly this possibility. And when the gate moved, they were through it in under 4 minutes. No fanfare. The gold cloaks at the inner walls stood down in the majority, not because they had been ordered to, but because they had spent 4 days looking at 50 Dragonbane engines, and 2 dragons and a column of Unsullied that did not appear to have a single soldier in it who was uncertain about anything, and the math of survival had produced a consensus without anyone calling a vote. The Unsullied moved through the streets in formation, which meant the streets were controlled before they were cleared, which meant by the time anyone with Lannister interests reached a position to respond, the city was no longer the city they had expected to find. The Mountain was in the Red Keep's outer yard. He was standing in the center of the yard in full armor when Jon's advance guard came through the inner gate, not moving, not fleeing, occupying the space the way the Mountain had always occupied spaces, as if the space had been built around him and everything else was a visitor. The Hound came through the gate 8 seconds after the advance guard. He stopped when he saw the Mountain. The advance guard moved around both of them, past them, through them, flowing into the keep's corridors on the directions they had memorized from the maps, and the Hound and the Mountain stood in the yard and looked at each other across 20 feet of cold stone. The Hound said, "You know how this ends." The Mountain made no sound. What followed was not a duel in any formal sense. It was 2 men doing what the other had needed for a very long time, in a yard clearing out around them as anyone with sense removed themselves from the radius. When it was done, it was done. The Hound walked out of it worse than he had walked in, and the Mountain did not walk out of it at all, and the advance guard moved on without the yard mattering to anyone anymore. Cersei was in the throne room, standing in front of the Iron Throne, not sitting on it. The distinction was precise and deliberate. A woman who understood the value of how you occupied space. She had sent the messenger 20 minutes ago, before the gates opened. She had made the decision and sent the messenger, and then the messenger had not come back, which meant either the thing was done or the thing had been interrupted, and the sound of the fighting in the outer yard suggested it had been interrupted. She was standing in front of the Iron Throne when Jon came in with 6 soldiers and Daenerys 3 steps to his left. She looked at them. She had thought about this moment. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, in the part of her mind that ran calculations regardless of whether she wanted them, that went on working through the night whether she slept or not, that had been working since the column arrived on the northern approach and the engines uncovered on the hills, and she understood what the half-circle meant. She had run the scenarios, she had known this was one of them. What she had not prepared for was how little she felt looking at it. Jon stopped 10 feet from her. He looked at her the way he looked at most things, without performance, as if the moment did not require anything from him beyond his attention, and his attention was sufficient. She said, "You came a long way to tell me I've lost." Her voice was even. She had her mother's voice when she needed it, controlled in the way that came from deciding, not from not feeling. She had always had that. Jon said, "You lost when the North stopped being afraid." He said it without satisfaction, without the particular quality of a victor completing the moment for the audience. He said it the way he had said most things to her, as a fact returned without decoration. Cersei looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Daenerys. She held that look longer. Something moved in it that was not acknowledgement and not defeat, but the particular recognition of one person who has built their entire existence around a specific kind of power, looking at another person who has built theirs around a different kind, and understanding for the first time that the second kind had an answer to the first. She said nothing. 4 of Jon's soldiers moved around her, and she let them. She held herself as she always held herself, without yielding, without collapse, without giving anyone in the room the satisfaction of a body that had surrendered even when the person inside it had no move remaining. Her hands were at her sides and her spine was straight, and the Iron Throne was 2 feet behind her, and she did not look at it. They walked her out of the throne room and she did not look back. Jaime was in the outer yard when they brought her through. He had come back to the keep an hour after the old gate opened, which was enough time for the outcome to be clear and enough distance from the mechanism to make the distance from the decision feel real. He was standing at the far edge of the yard, away from the movement, watching the city stabilize around him in the particular way cities stabilized when the fighting ended. Not quickly, but in layers, the outermost layers first. Cersei came through the yard under escort and saw him immediately. She looked at him across the yard. He looked back. He did not move toward her. She did not slow her pace. There was nothing left to say, which they both understood, and the understanding was the worst of it. Not the loss of her, not the loss of the position, but the recognition between them that had always lived under everything else, the recognition of 2 people who knew each other completely and had chosen, in the end, different destinations. She passed through the yard. Jaime stood at the edge of it and watched her go and thought about Eris, and the throne room, and the particular silence of a city that has just been saved from itself for the second time in the same lifetime. His right hand was empty at his side. His left was, too. The dragon pit had not been used for its intended purpose in over a century and a half. The dome had cracked in 3 places during the Dance of Dragons, and no one had repaired it because no one in 150 years had needed a building large enough to house living dragons. The cracks let in the sky, 3 long seams where gray light fell in slanted columns onto the floor below, and in that light you understood the scale of the place for the first time. 50 lords sat inside it and looked small. Tyrion had chosen the location deliberately. 2 days arguing the choice with Daenerys' household, who wanted the small council chamber, and with Jon's advisors, who didn't care where they met as long as it wasn't the throne room. The dragon pit was neutral, not the seat of Targaryen power, not a northern hall, not a room that belonged to anyone who would be in this meeting. It was a ruin, the last place anyone had tried to contain a dragon, the first place the dragons had broken free. He thought the symbolism was appropriate. He had arranged the seating himself. No head of table, a loose circle the way the Night's Watch held its assemblies, a custom he described to the steward as northern without mentioning he had read it in a book written 400 years ago. Jon sat with Sansa to his right. Daenerys sat across from them with Missandei beside her. The lords filled in around the circle in the order they arrived, which said nothing about precedence, which was the point. He stood in the center. He had written the speech 3 times. He had thrown out all 3 drafts. He spoke without notes. "The question before this council is not who rules," Tyrion said. He looked around the circle slowly, moving his attention from face to face in the sequence he had been using since childhood in rooms where everyone found him amusing for the wrong reasons. "That question has been answered by the events of the last 6 months. There is no value in relitigating it here." He turned toward the far arc of the circle where the dome opened in its 3 cracks and the sky showed through. "The question is what kind of rule becomes possible now. Aegon the Conqueror won this continent with 3 dragons. He built a realm that endured 3 centuries because no one could challenge the power behind the throne. That arrangement produced 100 years of stability and then produced Arya Targaryen." He paused. Unchallengeable power does not become wise simply because it endures. It becomes proud. Proud power, held long enough, becomes exactly the thing everyone else is dying to correct. The circle held its quiet. The North has demonstrated that a dragon is not a wall, Tyrion said. It is a weapon. Weapons can be countered. Under this pact, the schematics and training to build a Dragonbane engine will be available to every major seat of every great house, and to the primary-secondary seats of the principal lords. He looked at Daenerys. This is not a weapon against her grace. It is a weapon against the future, against the version of this conversation that takes place in 50 years, or 100, when the person on the throne has forgotten they are governing people rather than commanding them. Daenerys said, "And my dragons. We'll live in this dragon pit," Tyrion said. "With sky access, space, and the care of riders who have agreed to a specific doctrine, dragonfire is a weapon of last resort, used only under council consent." He held her eyes steadily. "Your Grace has said she wanted to break the wheel. This is what breaking it looks like. Not the absence of power, the accountability of it." The silence that followed was not resistance. It was 50 lords doing arithmetic and finding that the numbers, for once, produced something other than war. Jon refused the crown twice. The first refusal Tyrion had expected, the second he had absorbed and adjusted to. He had looked at Jon for a long moment and understood something he had been assembling across 6 months. A man built by what he had done, rather than by what he had been given, who understood with the particular clarity of someone who had carried authority he didn't want that a hereditary title was a different weight than the one he had already learned to bear. The third offer was not a crown. "Protector of the realms of men," Tyrion said. He said it simply, as if it had been obvious all along, which it hadn't been until the previous night when he had woken at the second hour and found it waiting for him, fully formed and patient. Not inherited, not dynastic, held by Jon Snow personally, recognized by both the Iron Throne and the Northern Crown, for the term of his natural life and no further. It acknowledges what you did. He paused. "Not what you were born, what you did." Daenerys said, "I second it." She said it before Jon answered. Before the room could shift or settle or fill the space with noise. She said it with the particular quality of a decision made privately and now spoken aloud at the moment it needed to be there. Jon was quiet. He looked at the floor of the dragon pit, worn stone, centuries of use, a long burned scar along the eastern arc where something had once exhaled here and meant it. He looked at Sansa, who looked back and said nothing. Sansa had learned precisely when not to speak. She had learned it the hard way, and she used everything she had learned the hard way with the same exactness. He said, "All right," no ceremony, no flourish, just the agreement of a man accepting a weight he has decided is his to carry. Sansa's formal recognition as queen in the North took 11 minutes. The document had been prepared beforehand. Tyrion had written it himself, which meant it was clear, unambiguous, and contained no language that could be reinterpreted by future lords with future agendas. The North's obligations, full participation in the defense of the realm against existential threats, northern seats on any multi-kingdom council dealing with threats of the Long Night's magnitude, their standing, independent, not isolated, allied without being subject. She signed it with the same hand she used to write supply manifests. The lords of the North who had traveled south with the column witnessed it. Lord Glover pressed his seal into the wax without expression. Lyanna Mormont pressed hers and looked at the room with the specific quality of attention she brought to everything, measuring, unimpressed, already thinking about the next problem. The Dragonbane engine in the throne room had been Sansa's idea. She had raised it the previous evening in 2 sentences, in a planning session with 5 people and no ceremony. A working installation, mounted on an iron frame beside the Iron Throne, aimed at the throne room's open ceiling. They had installed it that morning. It stood there now. The Iron Throne remained. They had discussed removing it and concluded that removing it solved nothing, and keeping it said something true about continuity, about the long accumulation of history that made a place what it was. The throne stayed. The engine stood beside it on its raised iron mount, the throwing arm pointing skyward, the bolt channel loaded, the crew positions marked on the floor around it. Anyone who sat the throne sat in its shadow. Anyone who came to argue before the throne looked at it. The symbolism was not subtle. That was the point. Bran was in the God's Wood of Winterfell when he felt the pact take shape. Not the way a person felt news arriving, not the way a soldier felt a battle end, the way he felt everything now, as a change in the network, a shift in what the trees knew. the 1,000 carved faces across the continent registering something different in the world they had been watching since before the first men came. He sat with his hands on the armrests of the chair. The heart tree moved in a wind he couldn't feel from where he sat, the red leaves dropping one at a time into the cold pool beneath it. He did not try to change what he saw. That was the first thing the previous three-eyed raven had taught him, and the last thing he had fully understood, and he understood it now completely. The past did not move when you touched it. It simply showed you what had been, and what had been was finished. And finished things had a weight and a permanence that nothing living could alter. He could only watch. He watched. The god's wood was cold and still, and the frost was forming at the edges of the pool. The red sap in the carved face of the heart tree had dried in the cold. Thin dark lines across the pale bark, like writing in a language that was almost readable. He closed his eyes. He kept watching. Sansa walked the north wall before the petitions began. Every morning, before the first steward arrived with the first report, before the supply manifests and the dispute arbitrations and the requests from houses rebuilding faster than their resources allowed, she walked the wall with her hands clasped behind her back and looked north, because north was where the threats had always come from, and looking north was her version of checking that the world was still where she had left it. The engines on the walls were maintained, the crews rotated on their winter schedule, the bolt channels cleared each morning, reseated each evening, the throwing arms inspected weekly by Tanner's second, who had learned what a stress fracture looked like before it became a failure and had written the inspection protocol himself. She stood on the north wall and looked at the wolf's wood. 17 things needed doing before noon. The weight of it was large and not impossible, the kind of weight you carried by not trying to carry all of it at once. She turned back toward the castle. Jon was in the Riverlands. He was on a horse on the King's Road, moving toward a bridge that needed inspection before the spring melt made it a problem. With 4 riders and a Lord Steward beside him who had the anxious energy of a man responsible for infrastructure that had been neglected for 3 years and knew it. Ghost ran alongside for a while, then he fell behind, distracted by something in the tree line. Jon did not call him back. The road ran south through bare trees that would be green in 2 months. The cold was still present, but different, looser, the kind that was letting go by degrees rather than holding with both hands. He rode. He thought about nothing in particular, and everything in general, in the way that moving toward the next problem made space for exactly that. The north is cold and full of whispers, but the whispers have changed. They no longer carry only dread, or the sound of things moving in darkness toward the living. They carry something else now, the ring of iron being shaped, the crack of a throwing arm under tension, the sound of men who looked into the eye of a dragon and found at last, not a god, a target. And beneath that sound, quieter and more difficult, the sound of people beginning the long work of building something that will not require gods or dragons or rulers who hold power through terror. Something that will require instead the ordinary, extraordinary willingness of men and women to arrive each morning, look at what is broken, and decide again that it is worth the fixing. The north is cold and full of whispers, but the whispers have changed. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end?